episode of Booked, a place to explore the realms of creativity. Before you continue to listen to this episode, please check out the description because there are some trigger warnings for this particular one. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's guest, Jack Ori. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm excited too. Honestly, I've been looking forward to this for so long. I'm so pleased that you're here because especially after reading Reinventing Hannah, I was like, I've got to get into this person's head and we've got to talk about what's going on and how you got to this point, and we've got to talk about your other books. So I'm hoping that you're ready to go on about your books a lot
Oh, I
today.
definitely am. Reinventing Hannah is a bit different than my other books because most of what I write is mysteries, but they all feature trauma survivors. Like my whole thing is if I can think of how to speak English. My whole thing is empowering trauma survivors. So that's why I write. And so my mysteries are similar to Reinventing Hannah in that my detectives are all trauma survivors who are trying to get justice for other people because of what happened to them. So it all comes out pretty much similar. With Reinventing Hannah in particular, this was a story that was really close to my heart because Hannah was who I would have been if I was not trans. So I kind of wrote a story where I gave her the friends that I didn't have in high school, but I also gave her this horrible experience, which is not what I had in high school either, luckily.
I'm very glad.
Um, but the part where her friend talks about being the girl with the heavy backpack who never went to her locker because the boys were bothering her there, that was true. That did happen to me. So that part was real. So I wanted to write a book. Basically, I started the genesis of the idea of a girl who has this horrible experience of being sexually assaulted on Halloween, and that's where I started from. And I knew I wanted it to be different than other books in the genre because a lot of books in the genre, there's some really great books in the genre like Speak, which is of course a classic, and The Way I Used to Be, which is also a classic. And I really enjoyed them, but in both those cases, the book was about someone who, after the event happens, they keep it to themselves and they pretty much like spiral downward, and then eventually they tell someone and they feel better in the end. So I wanted to write a different kind of story about what happens after the person tells, like what happens when they start talking about, and that was pretty much what Reinventing Hannah was. And a lot of times people think because I'm trans that it's about somebody transitioning. And
Oh, interesting. Oh, I didn't put those two and two
yeah,
together, if
and
that
so
helps.
constantly telling people that is not the case because
Okay.
one of the other things, and I didn't like plan to write it this way, but one of my other things was bridging the gap between trans people and cis people, because a lot of times people think trans people are these people over there who aren't the gender that they were born as, and most people can't relate to that and blah blah blah. But Hannah is a cisgender person who goes through his authenticity journey, right? Like she becomes more who she really is as she goes through the experience of speaking up for herself more and expressing herself differently. Um, and so I felt like that was a point of commonality that's not talked about, that trans people and cis people both have those periods in their life where you're like, you look in the mirror, you're like, something is wrong. This is not who I want to be.
Yeah.
This is not how I want to live my life. I have to make some changes. And for me, as a trans person, that happened to involve um, changing my gender presentation, and getting on hormones and that kind of stuff. For Hannah, as a cisgender person, she doesn't have that, but she wants to speak up more. She wants to be with the person she wants to be with. She wants to not care so much what other people think, you know, and all of that. And I felt like it's the same kind of thing.
It was incredibly relatable, I think, for a lot of people, even if you haven't experienced the exact things that happen. You've done such a good job of giving us a character where there's hope, and it felt very hopeful, which is weird considering like the central sort of plot in the middle where, this thing spirals off
Right.
for her and her journey. It was actually like a huge pleasure to read because I was like, oh, this is so uncomfortable, but in a good way, because you have to be uncomfortable, especially when you're talking about trauma, in my opinion,
Right.
because trauma's not comfortable, it then spurs growth, which is you can take that as however you want to relate to it, can't you?
Right.
So in whatever way it resonates with you, I think it does, you don't have to have had the same experience to relate to somebody. But as I think we've discussed before, obviously outside of this episode, it is hard to find. It's not impossible, but it's hard to find books where somebody has been sexually assaulted and they don't just end up in the gutter or
Right.
like having just the worst time and not being able to cope with it, because there are a lot of people who have experienced that type of trauma and have come out of it doing okay. And it's, it's different for everybody, but I think we're seeing now more people being able to speak out and it being received well, because you're always going to get people that like victim blame and say it was all their fault and all that sort of stuff, but there is a huge community of people that would rally around somebody, and it's nice to see that happen in your book.
Right, exactly, and I think that's one of the dangers of fictionalizing it is
Mm,
you want to show that's a terrible thing. You definitely don't want to gloss that over and be like, "Oh, this happened, so what?"
mm,
You know.
yeah,
But at the same
yeah,
time,
exactly.
you don't want to give the impression that if this happens to you, you're broken forever and nobody can and you can't function. Like that's
Yeah.
not really the message I wanted to send either. And
Hmm.
so I wanted people to come away from it feeling empowered and being like, I can speak up about this or about whatever it is in your life. It doesn't have to be that, you know.
Hmm.
It's the central premise is her changing, and it happens to be that she experienced this type of trauma, but it could have been
Hmm.
something else. It could have just been the fact that it could have been something like uh a more typical teenage thing where if this hadn't happened, where she finds out that the guy she likes has some other girlfriend, she also could have been
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
that would have worked equally well, but that wasn't the story I wanted to tell. You know, the main
Yeah.
story was about her realizing that she's been putting too much stock in what her friends think and
Hmm.
not being herself. In her case, of course, she's holding herself back also because her mom is bipolar and she's afraid, what if I'm bipolar? Which in itself is trauma.
Hmm. Yeah, you've managed to pack in a lot into a short period. I mean, it's not a short book by any means, but into this one story, you've packed so much stuff that resonated with me personally that I was like, oh man, this at the beginning I was like, this sucks, but not the book. The book didn't suck. I was like, I feel so bad for Hannah. This is awful. And I was like, okay, no, this is okay. She's feisty now. I like this very much, and I like that she got really ballsy and was like, okay, take me as I am or suck it. It was
Yeah,
good. I really liked
yeah.
it.
Which is pretty much, it's an interesting thing because her friends are used to her being that quiet person, right? So for her friend,
Mhm.
first speaking up, they're like, something's wrong. That's not her. But that's who she really is.
Yeah, exactly. And I really really appreciate what you have to say about bridging that gap between cisgender people and trans people, because we're all just trying to figure out what the hell we're doing, aren't we? That's kind of the central thing about being a human being is, okay, how can I be at my happiest and then doing that thing? And I think some people find that really challenging, and some people like us are just like, it's just part of life, isn't it? You don't, I don't like that about myself, so I'm going to change it. And it's
Right.
kind of the same for everybody, but a lot of times people will ignore the fact that there's that parallel because it's something that they maybe don't understand and they're scared of it. We're all just trying to make it by, but there we go.
Right.
You have a number of books out, and you said this one is quite a bit different than your others because you write sort of mystery books. So how different is it?
So it's only different, really, in the sense that it's not a mystery because it's not about like who did this, right? Like that's not what's important, right? We're just
Mhm.
not trying to find out who did it. Um, all my books take place in the fictional town of Cedarwood, and I've
Mhm.
added to it the fictional next to it town of Wilton. And reinventing Hannah is called Eastwood, the quote unquote bad area. But I might go back
Mhm.
and like re-release that at some later date with it name
Yeah.
change because in all my other books the neighboring town is Wilton. Um,
Mhm.
and so I've sort of built this world of suburban towns on Long Island, like fictional suburbs,
Mhm.
where Cedarwood is pretty much based on where I live, which is a more diverse kind of area, and you know it's for about 45 minutes from the city, from New York City. And then Wilton is a more conservative town, so it's more of a quote unquote red town. And
Okay.
one of the books that I have yet to write will be about a mystery that takes place in that town and an investigative journalist who's worried about how or what will happen to her daughter if she pursues this because it's a very conservative kind of area, and she's already worried because she has a gay daughter who's neurodivergent in this area. So,
Hmm.
um, so I've started building some of those things in. With my mysteries, it's slightly different, but not really different because it's like the trauma motivates them to solve the mystery. Like
I
um,
see.
in Open Secrets, which is the one that I
Hmm.
released in June. Um,
Hmm.
CJ is a non-binary college student who has in his past this horrible experience where when they were 14, they were tricked by an online predator into meeting in a secluded area, and um,
Hmm.
they they escaped, well, were briefly kidnapped by this person,
Okay.
and so that motivates them throughout the story to try to get justice for this classmate. Well, not really a classmate, it's like a graduate student at their school who's killed. They
Hmm.
find out that this person was trying to expose a teacher who was basically being inappropriate with female students.
Oh,
So
okay.
they want to get that story out, right? Because they're like,
Hmm.
this is what happened, like what happened to me. And this person was
Hmm.
silenced. I don't want their story to die with them, so I want to find out what really happened to them. And they don't care, like, what the school administration is not happy about that because school administration doesn't want people to think their school is not good and not come, right? so,
Okay, so there's a bit of politics in there as well within the school.
so, and then the one I'm working on now uh, is about a girl who, like my main character, suffers quite a different kind of trauma because when she was 3 years old, she was in the car with her parents and they were hit by a drunk driver. Her parents were killed, and she has
Hmm.
some disabilities. She has problems speaking because of the
Hmm.
brain injury, and then
Okay.
her best friend disappeared. So she's trying to
Oh,
find out
wow.
what happened, and she's
Hmm.
for her. The story is pretty much learning. Even though I have this disability, I can still do things. I can still
Hmm.
one who solves the case.
It seems like with a lot of your plots, you make sure there's like a hopeful element to them
Yeah.
to give people the. I suppose I'm just assuming, and please tell me if I'm wrong, but is that so that people can read it and relate to it and go, okay, there's a chance that things could be better for me as well.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I'm definitely all about empowerment, so that's like
I love it.
what I'm trying to do with all of my stories.
It's great, and you do very, very, very freaking well. I think you'll. Admittedly, I've only read the one book of yours, and I'm not going to stop there because the quality of your writing is excellent, your storytelling is excellent, and your the sort of structure that you have throughout the book. You've kind of got highs and lows, and definitely a real joy to read. And I love it when a book has an additional message and when the author has a purpose and a sort of goal, and something that they want people to get out of their books. Is there anything else that you want people to get out of your books other than the hopefulness?
I think just definitely the idea that we all have these things in common, right? Like a
Hmm.
lot of my books are LGBTQ specific, but
Hmm.
they're accessible to anybody, right? Like you don't need to. I had somebody put a comment on Open Secrets on Goodreads where they said, "Wow, there's an awful lot of gay content in here," and it's like, it's the LGBTQ section. What did you expect? Like they were shocked because CJ is non-binary, trans-masculine, and most
Hmm.
of their friends are gay. So there are like
Hmm.
several female-female relationships in the book. It's like, and
Just like real life, shockingly. It's like in real life is diverse. Oh my gosh, some people, honestly. I I've always been fascinated by people who read things, consume art, enjoy media, and they think, okay, well, these people are gay, so it must be just for diversity, or this person is neurodivergent, or that's hot right now. And it's like, well, no, all these people have existed for a very, 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 very long time, and finally it's safe not totally safe, I admit that, and I'm only speaking from an observant sort of viewpoint, but it's far safer now than it was 50 years ago
Right,
to be yourself out in public and be accepted and to actually talk about stuff. Like when I was a kid, like autism, for example, looked like this one particular thing. It looked like non-verbal or somebody that had hyperactivity or whatever it was, and same with the ADHD. When I was a kid, seemingly because nobody talked about it, it was only little boys that got ADHD and they just ran around,
right,
and that's just not the case.
right,
And it's really, really important to have these books, have these films, have this artwork, have whatever it is, this art form that represents everybody, because then people can just be comfortable. And
right. And it shows that you're not so alien, right? Like,
yeah,
I mean, you can read this book and you might not be like that person, but you can relate to them.
as I said earlier, we're just trying to get by. And I think by just concentrating on, like, if what you take from a book, and no disrespect to the commenter, they might have just been surprised by it.
I took it as a win because they said I would read another book by this author, so I was like,
Great,
good, maybe I
great.
opened their mind.
Love that. Changing minds and hearts. I love that very much.
My favorite comment was somebody who was like, 4 stars. This is a woke mystery. Emphasis on woke. I'm like,
4 stars is quite good. Was it out of 5?
yeah, out of 5. And I was like,
Oh,
okay.
that's great.
They took a point off for the quote unquote wokeness, but I'm like, you don't realize that that's actually, or maybe it was someone who liked that, but they wanted to warn people who wouldn't like it or something. Who knows?
Oh, maybe. Yeah. I think maybe they were trying to protect the art from mean people.
Yeah.
Quite possibly. So you've given me a rundown and given the listeners a rundown of the other works that you have in progress at the moment. So did you say you're just working on a singular novel at the moment, or do you have a few things
I have
going
a
on?
few things I'm working on. That's
Mhm.
the main thing I'm working on is like Quinn disappeared, or it should be the main thing I'm working on because I want to get it published. But I also started a short story, which, for lack of a better title right now, is called the Poisoned Potatoes. It takes place in a halfway house. It's a
Uh-huh.
story that takes place within the criminal justice system. All these girls are in uh a halfway house that's like an alternative to juvenile detention, where instead of
Mhm.
being locked up in jail and being treated as criminals, they're locked up in this place where they get therapy and uh,
Mhm.
stuff like that. And so one of the girls has a peanut allergy, and at dinner one night, all of a sudden she has an allergic reaction, and so then the protagonist is looking, Brianna is looking into who poisoned her because everybody thinks it's her friend who was the one who cooked the potatoes that night, and so
Mhm.
and then and so it's been a really interesting experience writing. When I studied social work, I was interested in criminal justice reform. Like that's a special interest
Mhm.
of mine. Um, so I just wanted to try to write this story that takes place in like this alternative to juvenile detention. Of course, the subplot is that because this happened, now the state is looking and is like, is this a safe place? Maybe we should close this place down and send them all to regular jail. Um,
Yeah.
and so that I'm probably going to use as like my lead magnet that people can get it for free if they sign up to my mailing list. But I started working on that
Ah,
at the same time. That's probably not going to be the title I stick with, but I didn't have a better title, so
I like it.
and
It
so
sounds a lot more fun than it probably is going to be for the characters.
yeah, I mean, the characters. There's obviously one of the points I want to make with it is that pretty much all of these teenagers who have been arrested for various stupid things, like Brianna was
Mhm.
arrested because her friend left drugs in her car, and so she was pulled over, and the cops were just like, "Oh well, it was in your car, so it's yours,"
Mhm.
and um, so obviously, all these girls who are in that situation all have some kind of trauma in their life that caused
Mhm.
them to commit stupid crimes. A lot of it's just like another girl who's in there um, was arrested for shoplifting because she's neurodivergent and she didn't realize these girls weren't her friends and they were like, hold on to this, and she didn't realize it wasn't paid for. And
Oh,
so so it's
that's
all
sad.
these kinds of things, but I also want it to be the sort of hopeful thing where it's like the whole point of them being in this program instead of in jail is that there are people who believe in them and believe
Mhm.
that they can turn their lives around, um and my whole intention with it is for Brianna to lose the idea that she's a victim because in the beginning, she's very angry she's in this situation because they weren't her
Mhm.
drugs, but she had a public defender who was just like, the best you can do is this. You're not going to be able to get out of this.
Mhm.
So she's angry she's in a situation. She feels that's unfair. She's black, so she also feels like there was racism involved in the whole thing. So it's a mystery, but it's also like a subtle critique of like the whole juvenile justice system. But
Mhm.
throughout this story, she's going to realize by the end she's not purely a victim,
Mhm.
that there are things she can do and that she can use this experience for the best, while also at the same time like just showing the politics of it and showing the whole thing that in some ways, you get a bunch of these girls together and then some of them are bullies, and the girl who
Mhm.
has a peanut allergy is a bully. But I also want to like show from a different perspective the kids who are bullies also do that for a reason, like not just because they're bad kids, So
Mhm.
as she learns about what was going on and why somebody did this, it's a lot more complicated than, oh, that girl is a bully, let's get rid of her,
Yeah, I think a lot of people are going to be able to resonate with that as well because at some point, I mean, I think most people I know anyway had terrible teenage years,
Yeah,
and were either bullied or they were bullies. I was kind of both. I realized as I'm an adult that I was actually a really horrible teenager, really mean to my friends, and now I'm like trying my hardest to be as nice as possible. But at the time, was lashing out because I wasn't happy, and I didn't realize that for like 10 years or something.
right.
And I look back and I was like, man, I was an asshole. Do you put yourself or any parts of your personality into your characters, or do you find it hard to do that?
I think they're definitely parts of myself. I mean, the character takes over to an extent, so
Hmm.
it's like they're them. They're not exactly me, but there are definitely. First of all, we're all human, like we've been talking about.
Hmm.
You can definitely relate, like my story. Obviously, in the poison potatoes, I'm not black, and I've never been in a jail type situation like that.
Hmm.
But I can relate to that idea of feeling like this whole thing is unjust and nobody cares. I think everyone can
Hmm.
relate to that. And just
Hmm.
having that sense of justice. And in some ways, my characters are like the braver version of me. Like they're the part of me that would like speak up and like don't care what happens. And like, you know, if I get kicked out of school or a kidnapper comes after me or something, oh well. Like,
Hmm.
that larger than life, I don't
Yeah.
care. I'm just gonna do the right thing, kind of thing, which is something that's a value, but that's like not really who I am. Like I would not have that much courage.
Oh my gosh, me either. I talk a big game, but I'm actually a bit of a fanny. I like to think I'm confident, but I know I'm not. Do you live vicariously through your characters
So yeah,
sometimes?
definitely I
Yeah.
do. And a lot of times when I have to do something that's scary, I might be like, I can switch it to Hannah because Hannah can do this, or whatever character.
Oh,
Like
yeah,
like
that's nice.
they can do this. So
Oh, your characters are there for you. That makes me really happy. You're an indie author.
yes,
Have you considered going down the traditional route at all,
I
or is that something that
I
didn't
did
work?
for a time, but I think for me, it's not for me. So
Okay.
I have some friends who are of the opinion that indie authors are people who just couldn't get published traditionally, which we know is not true. And
Wrong. That is wrong, people.
yeah, and so I think they were like the ones encouraging me to go trad, and
Hmm.
I think that I tried it. I have this book that I'm going to actually finish writing at some point. I'm gonna rewrite. It was
Hmm.
called Heart Failure. Now it's called Her Sacred Oath, and it takes place in a hospital. It's this doctor in training who has PTSD because she's a survivor of domestic violence, and
Okay.
uh, somebody at the hospital is like, she finds the body of a colleague who died of an apparent overdose, and somebody at the hospital is is causing trouble and making it look like she wrote all these prescriptions for opioids that she didn't write and
Mhm.
trying to ruin her career until she's trying to find out what's really going on. And so
Oh,
I
interesting.
tried to get it published traditionally, and I sent it to agents for a year. Nobody was interested, and
Fools.
at some point, like I would get like conferences. Oh yeah, send it to me. This sounds great, and then I sent it to them. I never hear.
Mhm.
You know, um, and so and I understand agents are very busy, so sometimes silence is a
Mhm.
no. But
Mhm.
I kind of felt like this process is too freaking slow. If I were to get first it takes you a couple of years to get an agent. Then the agent has to send it to publishers, and then publishers have to decide whether they're going to accept it. That'll take another couple of years. That publisher accepts it. It'll take another year before they're ready to go to print. And I'm like, I would like to not take 10 years to publish one book. I could publish three books in the time that I've spent trying to get agents to pay attention to this. And so that's on my list to rewrite later the way that I want to
Mhm.
write it because I think I also was trying to write it as if I'm going to write this for trad, and I don't feel it was at its best, which might be why nobody
Mhm.
wanted it because it wasn't ready. But
Mhm.
at the same time, I also I don't want to be beholden to someone else's timeline or to someone else's
Mhm.
decision making power. I'd rather be the one who makes the decisions about this is ready. And that
Yeah.
doesn't mean don't work with anybody. It doesn't mean like, oh, I'm just gonna put it out there and hope for the best. Like, you know, I show it to
Mhm.
other people, get feedback, work with
Mhm.
an editor, you know, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Uh but not someone else having the decision whether or not it ever sees the light of day.
Yeah, I get you. I mean, you mentioned just now that you sort of feel that you wrote it with the mindset of it going down the traditional route. So, what can you think of any elements of it that you either like omitted or added that would have fit into that sort of category that you think it would have done?
I mean, it's not anything specific. It's not like I sat down and was like, "Oh, this is what's good for trad publishing." But I do think I did a workshop
Mhm.
with a very well-known agent, and she made some suggestions on my opening, and so I changed the opening
Mhm.
so that it was very fast. First scene, she is at work with a headache, and second scene, she finds the body right away. And I feel like it's too
Mhm.
fast paced. And I'd like to. And in my original draft, I showed her at rounds during the beginning
Mhm.
of her day and introduced the characters before
Okay.
I got to that. And I actually think that's better because then people get the idea of who she is before this happens. Um, and so I wanted to
Okay.
make her more well-rounded and show
Mhm.
more of her ordinary world. I'm very much into the hero's journey, so her ordinary world where she's at rounds and she's not really confident, and there's this asshole guy who speaks over her. So when the doctor or in charge of rounds asks her a question, the guy answers it and doesn't let her speak. And so I thought it was important to show that, and I had taken it out because I didn't want to slow things
Mm.
down.
That's interesting.
A lot of things in traditional publishing too is don't start, you want to make sure that the first page is extremely interesting and you want to be very fast paced and you want and certain things like don't start with the character thinking or don't start with this or don't start with that. And so I originally had the idea when I of starting with her driving and having PTSD flashbacks, and the agent was like, "No, no, 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 you don't want to do that because it's too." And I think when you're writing a book about someone who has PTSD,
Mm.
showing them driving is not so, and having PTSD flashbacks is not so
Yeah,
bad.
it's real.
I do agree that you want to get to the actual mystery in a mystery as soon as you possibly can. So I do agree with that, but I also think that I cut out too many things that were
Mhm.
necessary to set things up.
See, it's your story, and I can't. That's kind of the beauty of going down the indie route is that you
Yeah,
don't have to
exactly.
compromise.
And you let the reader tell you if they like it or not.
Exactly, because I think, but I mean, people get focused on like, oh, I want to sell X Y Z many books, and I'm only going to be successful if I make all my money back and stuff. But I think if you focused purely on how you want the story to be told, and how you want people to actually read that story, because it's totally up to you. That if one person reads it and likes it, you kind of won.
Right, exactly.
Mm.
And for reinventing Hannah, I always get I always feel good when I get these reviews from people. Sometimes people feel like I'm not even in a place to read this right now, but I'm glad that it exists.
Oh, that's
And
nice.
I love those kinds of reviews. Like that's what makes me feel good.
Mhm.
Well, if you're listeners, if you've read any of my books, please leave a review.
They are incredibly important. I've got personally mixed feelings about reviews, but they are kind of like the currency of book reading and writing, other than the money part. Um, and they do mean an awful lot to especially indie writers who don't have, this big marketing team behind them, and you're kind of relying on word of mouth a lot of the time.
Right.
So what is the most challenging thing about being an indie writer for you?
So I think a couple of things. One is trying to write in a timely manner.
Mhm.
When you're an indie author, you can publish whatever you want, but if you don't publish a book except once every 5 years, it's hard to get a following. Um, so, it always takes longer than I think it will. No matter what I do, the first 3 or 4 drafts are just exploring the character before I know what I'm doing.
Mhm.
Um, so I think that's really challenging. I think balancing it with what else I'm doing is challenging because I write full time as a freelance author, so I make most of my money writing TV reviews and editorials for TV Fanatic and Screen Rant.
Oh,
And
cool.
so it's really cool, but it ends up being a full time job because by the time I've written 4 articles, it's like 5 p.m., you
Mm,
know? So then just finding that time to write can be challenging. Um, and just overcoming the stigma of people who think, oh, you're an indie published, you're not a real writer, and don't want to read it because they think it means it's crap.
yeah.
That's really annoying when people are like that.
We're going to prove them wrong, aren't we, Jack? We're
Yes.
proving them wrong. I think through doing this podcast and creating the website, Indiosyncrasy, I'm really hoping that people can see that there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of writers who have gone down the indie route and write incredible
Yes.
books. I'm not saying that there's going to be hundreds of thousands of people on this website because I'm only one person. But I think it's
If you start getting hundreds of thousands of people, you're gonna have to start outsourcing and
I don't have the kind of budget for that. I'm doing this for free. I'm doing it because I want to. But I think it's made a huge difference. I've said this in other interviews as well. To speak with the person that's written the book and to
yeah,
experience the process of writing it sort of through them, and learning about what challenges there were, and why did you do this, and what do you hope people get out of it. It makes the book look different. It makes it read different because
yeah.
you get the opportunity to interact with its creator, which is really cool. So I'm hoping that this kind of leads people to read more of your work.
I hope so. I'm really excited about that possibility.
Me too. And honestly, I'm not just blowing smoke. Reinventing Hannah was excellent. I really, really, really liked it. But only read it if you are in a place that you, as you said earlier, about some of the reviews you had. Only read it if you're in the place where you can handle it. It's something that I related to very, very personally, and the thing that I related to about it happened a very long time ago, and I'm now in a place where that's fine and I can read it and I'm like, okay, yeah, go on, that's really good. But I think if I'd have read this like 7, 8 years ago, I would have found it a bit challenging. So protect
Right,
your own peace and protect your own mental health before you do
right.
anything, in general. Just in life, as you're
Yeah,
going through life, just protect yourself.
I think trigger warnings are really important. For some reason, they're controversial in the writing community.
Yeah.
You always see on websites people who are all like, "I'm not going to coddle anyone if they're going to be triggered. That's their problem." And it's like, that's such a selfish attitude.
I think that trigger warnings are incredibly important. With the website, my goal was to give people the opportunity to look for the trigger warnings if they wanted to. Because some people
Yeah.
don't want to. Some people have a really strong stomach. They haven't had anything horrible happen to them, or if they have, that they've gotten over it, or they can deal with it. It doesn't bother them. That's fine. I'm very happy for you. I'm glad that you've got that. But to prevent other people from being able to stop themselves from having to relive trauma and then like messing themselves up for a few months because they're reliving it again. Give people that opportunity, or market to the right audience that you know is going to be receptive of it without the trigger
Right.
warnings. Like with, for example, extreme horror, erotica, things like that. If you're marketing specifically to that audience and you're like, this is going to have a load of like terrifying stuff in it or really uncomfortable things, people know that going in. But if you're reading a mystery novel, you might not expect it to have PTSD in it. You're not expect it to have, bullies or violence or whatever it is that it contains. So why not give people the opportunity to say no thank you before it's too late and they've read it already?
Right, exactly. And everyone's different, and I do try not to go into too graphic detail. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I very purposely reinventing Hannah. I did not show much of what happened to her
Yeah,
because that was, first of all, that's I didn't want it to turn into like trauma porn,
yeah.
And I didn't want it, and the specific details are not the point.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt you can get the idea of what happened to Romeo. I did show it also because it was drug facilitated and she's not aware of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
I also thought it was more powerful to have it the way I did it, where the scene begins. She's on the couch with the guy, and then she wakes up in her friend's room, and she's like, "How did I get here? What happened?"
Yeah, that was so scary to read. Like it was off page, but
Yeah,
it was very obvious what it was, and I read it and I was
right.
like, oh Hannah, I felt so bad. It would have been really easy for you to have just been like, this is exactly how it happened, but that's a really good way of just making people just feel a bit sick, or
Yeah,
making them
and you don't
uncomfortable for
want
the
to like,
sake of shock value.
yeah, and you don't want to like overdo that kind of stuff. First of all, it's a young adult novel, so you
Yes.
don't want to get too graphic anyway.
Mhm.
And secondly, unfortunately, there are some people who read that kind of stuff because it turns them on. So you don't want to
Yeah, I want to
encourage
attract that
that.
audience. Yeah.
And again, like I always kind of felt like the details aren't the point. The audience just needs enough details to know this happened to her.
Yeah.
They don't need to know every detail of how she was violated.
Yeah. Well, exactly. Yeah. I certainly didn't need all the details, so I'm glad they weren't in there.
I tried to write it like the opening of an SVU episode,
Oh, yeah. I see that.
but it's supposed to be, Olivia Benson's supposed to be the cop that everyone wishes existed, who's really a social worker, who's like holding the victim's hand, is like, it's okay, you'll get through
Mhm.
this.
So I read in one of your bios that you've been writing since you were 6.
Yes,
So you didn't have a choice, really. You were going to be a writer.
yeah.
Yeah.
I learned to read when I was 4, and I never put a book down my whole childhood. So
That's so nice. That's very wholesome. So what kind of books do you like reading? Because I know you like writing like mysteries and thrillers and things like that.
yeah,
But
so I like reading mysteries. I like reading young adult fiction.
hmm
I also like generational stories, like um, stories that start with one generation and then it goes on. They have kids and
hmm
it's about what happens to kids and it goes on from there.
hmm is that what you kind of exclusively read, or do you ever go off piste?
I usually anything that sounds interesting, I'll read.
Hmm
Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to read these days. A lot of times, books just sit on my shelf for like 6 months before I get to them.
That's not long. That's not that long. Don't make me feel bad for my books that have been on my shelf for 12 months.
Well, I do have some that have been there for years, honestly. So, but yeah, I don't have a lot of time to read. But anything that sounds interesting, if I look at the cover of Life, I'm like, oh, this sounds interesting. And most books, even if they're not mysteries, have some sort of mystery angle to them.
Mhm,
So you can pretty much read anything. I don't really like extreme horror because I don't I'm very squeamish. I don't like anything that's gory and full of blood and that kind of thing.
mhm. It's really not for everyone. I I love it. but I don't like scary films. Well, I like some scary films. I like things like old 80s slashers and like the Alien films, for example.
Right.
And if they've got like a kind of true crime element, or if like the Hannibal series, I know they were originally books, fantastic books. Um, but I can't watch people suffering. It makes me deeply unhappy. Like
Yeah, me too.
like I can read a horribly torturous book and I'm like, that was fun to read. I don't know why. I'm not like, oh, I love it, but I just enjoy them because I'm like, okay, so that's true horror to me, is things that can happen to real people in real life and that have happened to real people. So when they're like on the cusp of being in like very much in reality, but
Yeah.
gratuitous violence in film where they've had to go to great lengths to make it look as gory as possible and to have the shock value,
I
it
don't
makes
like
me
that either.
panic. I don't like it. I don't want to see it. I can dumb it down in my head. I can make it calmer and make it less creepy and scary in my
You
head.
can read because you can kind of read and get the gist of it, and if it's too much, you can kind of skim that part and be like,
And it's not burned into your retinas, horrifying you until the day you
right,
die. I remember trying to watch. I was at a sleepover when I was a teenager, and my friends were like, "Oh, we should watch the Saw films." I was like, "I don't want to do that," and they put one of them on, and within a couple of minutes, I had a panic attack, and I was like, "We need to turn this off." People are suffering, and I don't like it. It makes me deeply unhappy. Books, however, different story. Don't know what it is.
Um, in terms
yeah,
of, I know that you've already talked about the works in progress that you have, and as much like all creative people, it's not just one thing, but you're trying to concentrate on one thing, and that's kind of like the plot line for
yeah.
everybody that writes. Um, do you think that are you sort of confident that you know what's going to come out next, or are you planning on working on something different, like poetry or short stories?
I mean, keep trying to write short stories, and they keep turning into novels. So I don't think we get short story writers in the cards for me because every short story ends up being not a short story. Like this new one of the poison potatoes was supposed to be a short story. I was like, okay, one scene per part
Mhm.
of the book. I can do that, and I was already 50 pages, so I don't think that's working out. so, um, so I don't think short stories are in the cards. I would love to have short story. I have maybe 3 or 4 actual short stories I would love to put out in, like, an anthology,
Mhm.
but there's not enough of them. Maybe someday. I wrote a short story that was, like, 10,000 words, which is long
Mhm.
for a short story. I wrote it for an anthology that said limit of 10,000 words, and then they didn't take the piece, so now I'm like, "What
Aw.
do I do with it?" Um so, but I might want to put that out at some point because it's something I'm really proud of. And this one is not a mystery at all. It's about a girl who's demisexual and she goes
Mhm.
to college and her high school boyfriend stays home. And it like is all sorts of each scene is a little vignette from a different part of her
Mhm.
college experience. So it goes through like the whole year where first it's her graduation party from high school and she doesn't want to let go
Mhm.
of her boyfriend. And then she goes to college and she meets her new roommates, and then she meets this guy, but she holds herself back because she's got
Mhm.
a boyfriend at home, and then and then she and her friends do this, and she's starting to think about this guy, but she feels guilty, and then she goes home for the holidays, and things are awkward with her boyfriend, and it goes through the whole thing to finally at the end, it's the next summer, and she and her boyfriend finally both are like mutually like, this is done. This was a high school thing. We're not
Mhm.
together anymore and the like the sad bittersweet ending where they realize it didn't work out, but they also realize that they're both growing up and moving on. So I'm really
Yeah.
proud of it, and I don't think I can cut anything from
And
it.
so you shouldn't.
And so I just need to figure out am I going to put it out as like a
Mhm.
novella or like a short story, quote unquote long short story myself. I'm like, what am I going to do with it?
You'll figure it out in the end. I think when it's time,
Yeah,
when it's go time, and you're like, okay, it's time to set it free into the hands and in front of the eyes of readers. And you said listeners. Um,
yeah.
then you'll figure it out. I'm sure.
I just want to like encourage everybody, if you're listening to this and you're dealing with any sort of stuff, just know that you're not alone. Like
Mhm.
that's my whole thing. Is that's why I write is that people won't be
Oh,
alone.
Jack.
That they can see themselves in my books.
Oh, that's such a gorgeous message, and I'm so glad that you have such purpose behind your writing, and it really does, really does come across in the way that you present your work. So thank you very much for doing what you do. Um, please tell our listeners where to find you and your work.
Yes. So, just remember author Jack Ori, because you can find me on my website is authorjackori.com. On Twitter and Threads, I'm author, and Instagram, I'm author Jack Ori. On Facebook and TikTok, I'm LGBT author Jack Ori, because I had technical difficulties and it wouldn't let me put what I wanted, so I
Okay,
had to add
great.
something to it. so, um, so you can find me any of those places. My website, you'll see there's a place that says books, which I really have to update because it has a book that I'm not that
Mm-hmm.
I kind of shelved for a while on there. So I'm gonna update that at some point. But you'll get an idea of what my books are. You can actually see I have pages on there for Reinventing Hannah and
Mm-hmm.
Open Secrets right now. So that's always great, and there's a contact form there, so you can also email me through the contact form or jack at authorjackory.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So I will also put the links in the description of the episode. So if you've gotten to this point in the episode and you think, oh, I haven't got a pen because I'm driving, it's okay. You can stop and you can copy and paste that that link from the episode description, and I'll put your social media links on there as well. But yeah, thank you again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was fun.